All right. Welcome to the Nothing Human podcast live Q&A session number 17. And I am a little late. I'm sorry, but I'm not that sorry though cuz I've been working pretty hard today and doing my best. All right. So, if you all have any questions and you show up and you want to ask them, feel free to go on the um, chat and ask anything you want to ask, and I'll try my best to answer it. Um, I've got a couple of things that I wanted to talk about today, and I will get to those in just a second. But first, I'm going to try my hardest to get this chat to be a little bit bigger in my teleprompter, but it doesn't look like it's going to do that. So anyway, I may have to take this cool teleprompter situation and bring it down here again so that I can look at this screen so you can look like I'm not looking at your faces or your eyes or whatever. I don't know. Does it look like I'm looking into your eyes? Let me know in the chat. Anyway, so the stuff I wanted to talk about today, I have a couple of things. For one, I have a new poem that I just wrote yesterday that I think is pretty funny, and I think you might like it. And I also have a leftover question from um, last stream that I didn't get to. So we'll try and get to that. And then I also have a couple of additional things that I want to talk about. So um, we'll get to that when we get to it. But first things first, doesn't look like anybody is here. So everybody who comes later can see what's up on the recording. Anyway, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I've been thinking a lot about a few different things recently. One of them, pretty massively, is by massively I mean that I've been thinking about it a lot. Um, is holiness. Um, I think somebody's on the chat. The chat text is so small that I cannot read it, and I've tried to figure out how to make it bigger, but it doesn't work. So Sunshine is here, and my mom is here. Hey everybody. So I'm just gonna put the chat back where it used to be here. So because I can't read any of your stuff up there. It's too small. Oh my goodness. I feel like technical difficulties should be the name of this. Should just this whole thing should be just named technical difficulties. All right. Anyway, so I've been thinking a lot recently because I'm reading a book called The Soul of Shame. I just finished a book called The Soul of Desire by Kurt Thompson, and then I decided to go and move on to another book that he has called The Soul of Shame, which is the reason I'm reading it is because the Soul of Desire was good, but he references the Soul of Shame a few times in it. And this book is actually really good. I highly recommend it. It's caused me to reconsider how important and central shame is in the overall story of human brokenness. And I've known for a long time, obviously, that shame is an issue with a lot of people, but I hadn't really thought about the degree to which shame is really pretty pervasive in most people, and in some ways, sort of a precipitator of a lot of sin, which is kind of counterintuitive. And this goes back maybe to the last time we talked. I talked about loving yourself, accepting yourself. I wanted to talk more about that because I think that recently, especially in terms of shame, because he says shame is the feeling that you are less than, the feeling that you are inadequate, that you're not enough, that you are not up to the task. And that is usually connected, I think, to this idea that Satan kind of draws from. The evidences are that you have failed. So you are a failure. So if you failed in any way, then obviously you're not enough, or you can't do it, or you're not going to make it. You're less than. And so I've been thinking a lot about what does it mean to be perfect. Multiple people in the scriptures are called perfect that are not Jesus. So I'm assuming that they sinned. Like Job, for instance, is called Tamim, perfect. Usually they will translate that blameless, meaning without blame. But it really is the word perfect. It means whole, complete. And I wanted to think about there is a way to consider perfection that it's not static, that isn't just a stasis, but is rather a um, a growing thing. And I'll tell you why. So we would all agree that Jesus is righteous, meaning that he didn't sin at all in his life. All Christians would agree on that. But you have texts, and this the text that mentions it, I think, is Luke, where it says that Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and humankind. And that's drawing from, actually, it's kind of a quotation from Samuel, what was said about Samuel, that he grew in wisdom and stature and favor. And so, how is it possible that Jesus grew if Jesus was sinless? If Jesus was perfect, then isn't perfection in our minds kind of has this idea of static, unchanging? And that's not really the way that the scriptures uses that term oftentimes. And I think it's actually unhelpful to think about perfection in those terms. So, because the only thing that's truly static for a living thing is death. I mean, when you die, you'll be unchanging and you'll never change again. But as long as we are alive, there will be fluctuations, seasons, changes, things like that. And as long as you're alive in a body, that's the case. And that doesn't mean that you aren't everything that you need to be or that you should be the way you are in your current and appropriate context. So, for instance, we might say something like, oh, he's just a perfect baby. A perfect baby, if a perfect baby were to never change and never grow, if perfection for the baby meant that he should be like that for the rest of his life, well, that perfect baby would be a really terrible 20-year-old or 40-year-old, if he, and not only that, the things that you could expect of an older person, of an adult, you would never put those burdens on a baby. Like you wouldn't, put them in the middle of a desert with a compass and a map and enough resources to survive and all the clothes and tents and stuff that they needed to live and say, okay, you're a perfect baby, so you can figure it out because you're perfect, right? I could figure it out, and I don't think I'm perfect. I don't know. It's just silly. So I'm being a little silly about it, but I do think it's really important to recognize when the scriptures calls Job perfect, it means that he's whole or complete or capable or fitting in the context that he's in. God is not looking at Job and saying, oh, well, Job's perfect, so Job can lift a mountain on his back, or Job is completely and utterly without mistakes or, turning backs or failures or anything like that. That's not really what it means, obviously, because Job, I believe, sinned and had failures and other things. So looking at it in those terms, I think is really important because shame is going to come in and say, because you have failed, therefore you are inadequate or you're broken. But I think, and this sounds really weird even to me to say, but I think the idea of perfection as wholeness or appropriateness in your context means that most people could be perfect or they could operate perfectly in their environment. It's going to look different for different people in the same ways that it would look different for a baby, than it would look different for somebody who's older, or somebody who has more capacity. The idea of perfection differs as you grow and as your circumstances grow. But you could still be whole or complete or fitting or appropriate in your context and have everything that you need in order to accomplish what God has called you to accomplish. And if you actually take advantage of or receive everything that you need to accomplish everything that God has given you to accomplish, then that is blameless. You are operating in a blameless or in a perfect way in those terms. And Job apparently did that. So I've been thinking a lot about that because I think the trick is that if you believe yourself to be inadequate and incapable, the problem is that it tends to actually deepen the cycle of sin and failure that made you feel that shame or that inadequacy in the first place. And I'll give you an example. It's a little bit messed up. I was telling my kids about this morning. You know, anyway, sometimes there are studies that they do where you're like, that the people who did those studies and actually went through with that, they maybe had some problems emotionally and psychologically and spiritually. Anyway, it was an experiment that they did on mice. And basically, what they did is they were trying to determine how long mice would be able to tread water if they were put into a water tank where there was no way that they could escape. And so they put these mice into this water tank and they timed how long it took before they passed out from exhaustion and sunk into the water and drowned. I hope, I think that they pulled them out before they drowned after they sank, but I'm not really sure because even the experiment itself does indicate some degree of sadism here on the part of the experimenters. So, but they timed it. They got an average time of what most of these mice were actually able to handle, like how many minutes they could tread water before they were so exhausted that they sank and drowned. And so then after they had that time that they had set on average for most mice, they had a group of mice that they pulled out of the water right before they would have been so exhausted that they passed out. And so these mice, had been treading water for basically the maximum length of time and then had been rescued from the water and lived. All right. Then they took those mice, they gave them a very short rest. It was not long enough for them to recover back to their normal level of endurance. They gave them a very short rest, and they took those mice that they had pulled out of the water, and they put them right back in the water. And what was interesting is that the mice who had been pulled out of the water right before they had reached that exhaustion and sunk down in the water, the second time they got in the water, you'd think they're tired, they've got nothing left, like they're not going to be able to tread water for as long even as they did the first time. And that's not what happened. They were able to tread water for 3, 4, 5 times the length that they had originally tread water. And the researchers think it's because they had hope that they would eventually be pulled out if only they held on. And what's really interesting is that endurance that's there is not really a matter of physical capacity, because they truly were exhausted physically and passing out, and they wanted to survive. I mean, they actually did want to survive. So the first time when, they only were able to go for so long, and then the second time when they were able to go 3 or 4 or 5 times, it's hardly a biological reality. It seems more like an emotional reality, that there are reserves or capacities to you in a state of hope that are not really available to you in a state of despair or a state of hopelessness. And shame really does want to make you believe that you are inadequate and not whole, not adequate to the task, not capable of what God is calling you to do, so that you resent Him, so that you fail, and then so you give yourself over to a cycle of failure by saying, I'm not good enough, I'm just like this, I'm a horrible person, I can't make it happen. And so in those terms, I think actually that perfection is the starting point. The wholeness is the starting point. We are whole. And the thing is, that's really what the nature of justification is anyway, that God says you are righteous. And from a state of righteousness, you're actually able to grow. And because it's growth that God wants from us, not static perfection. The idea of static perfection is not a human or living concept. He wants us to grow, and you can grow even in a state of righteousness, as we know from Jesus. So God says, I give you this righteousness so that you can be whole. And when you believe that, when you trust God and you believe He has given me everything that I need in order to do what He's called me to do, you're like that, the second mouse the second wind, where it's like he believes in something, and that actually affects what he's able to endure and what he's able to do. If you tell yourself you can't do it, if you tell yourself the thing that God has given me to do is too great, the temptation is too much, I'm too weak, I can't do it, then you won't. But if God has given you, it says that there's no temptation that has come to man that does not have the way of escape. Okay, so that there is a way of escape, but the way of escape, it has to occur to some extent because we trust and have faith in God that He's giving us everything that we need, and that He wouldn't put a task on us that we wouldn't be able to follow through on. And you believe that, and then you follow through on it, or you don't believe it, and then you don't. And either way, your belief is confirmed. So that's something I've been thinking about recently in terms of the concept of perfection. And I really do think it's important to recognize that even though we fail, God loves us and God views us as being whole people. In the same way that you love your children, even though you know that they're in a state of growth and that they're somewhat limited, but you look at them and you say, I love you as you are. And again, you can say, you're a perfect baby, or you're a perfect toddler, or you're a perfect child. You're everything that I asked for you to be. And you have everything available to you to do what is appropriate in your particular context and circumstances. All right. So maybe at some point I'll talk to you all about holiness, but that's not for today. I still need to do a little bit more work, but I do have some really interesting stuff that I'm thinking about in terms of holiness, to make a distinction between holiness and righteousness that I think is valid, because I don't think much distinction is made most of the time between holiness and righteousness, and I don't think that's good, because they're two different words and there's two different concepts there. And I think that it is helpful for us to, when the scriptures makes a distinction, for us to make a distinction as well, and to find out what they actually mean by the words they're using. All right. So I thought that I had some questions. No. I thought I had some questions for my live stream from the last one, and I know that I did, but I may have to just read it off my phone if you all will be patient with me for a moment. I will find it. But you guys, if you have any questions or anything, you can talk about it on chat. Okay. Yeah. You had a leftover one about prophets. Yep. Okay, Esther, thank you. Oh, that's not Esther, it's Lisa. Okay, so yeah, I found it on my phone. So this question is from my friend Andre. He's awesome. He lives in Bosnia now, Banja Luka, Bosnia. He says, as I listen, read, and talk to you about the powers of the Spirit, I realize more and more that my main power is mind and secondary affections. I thought at first that my main was affections, but I'm almost certain now that it is in this order. Since I recognize the stranger trauma in my heart and already knew that I am a prophet, or at least function in a prophetic potential. Having that in mind, I would like to hear your opinion on a role of prophets in the church, especially in the context of what you've already said in this episode. More specifically, if we are truly destined not to conform to both civil and or church system, what would be our role and place in the church, especially if we are in a full-time ministry? You know my story and the misunderstandings I have with people within the church system, but would like to know, how do you see people like me to better serve within that system? It's pretty much a me question, but I hope the answer could be good for many of us. So if Andre is that order, which he might be, he would be really similar to the order that I am, as far as I can tell. And although I have a really strong partnership between intellect and affections, so that maybe we differ in that. Not really sure. Andre's a pretty affectionate guy too, so I don't know. But he's also an artist, so that usually most artists are either intellect affections or affections intellect. Almost all artists are will last, so that tells you a little something about why artists have particular personality commonalities in terms of, schedule and budget and being flakes and all the rest of that. They have other strengths. All right, but the prophet in the church, well, There are two different kinds of prophets in the scriptures. I'm going to drink some water. There are two different kinds of prophets in the scriptures, and at least, but some of the prophets were actually priests, like Jeremiah and Ezekiel were both priests, which means that they functioned within the priestly system. They were called as prophets, but they actually had formal positions as priests within the temple or tabernacle system, temple system at that time. Jeremiah actually saw the temple destroyed. Anyway, and Ezekiel was an exilic prophet. So anyway, they were both priests. And then you have Isaiah, who I don't think, I'm pretty sure he was not a priest. And then you have a lot of others, like who was the guy that was like a farmer. You guys can tell me in the chat. And there's prophets can be called from anywhere, but some prophets actually did have a place within the ecclesiastical or institutional church system. I mean, obviously, we wouldn't necessarily have called it a church, but maybe we should. Anyway, so they had a formal religious position. How about that? But then obviously you have, John the Baptist, who was a wilderness preacher, and you had Elijah. He just wandered about. I don't even know that he was actually a prophet to Israel during a time when Israel was separate from Judah. And so he wouldn't have even had access to the legitimate temple system there. So I do think that a prophet has to go wherever the prophet is called. I mean, Jonah was called as a prophet in Israel and was a prophet and prophesied in Israel, but then was called to Nineveh, and he was supposed to go, and he didn't want to because he didn't like the Ninevites. And so that was, so I think a prophet has to go wherever a prophet goes. And all prophets, no matter where they go, typically speaking, most prophets have an outsider position. They're treated as outsiders. There's lots of reasons why they might be treated as outsiders. But if you think about prophets functioning as truth tellers, most people do not like the truth very much. How about this? Most people are afraid of the truth. It's not, if you said, "Hey, do you hate the truth? Or are you a liar?" They'd say, "Oh no, I love the truth. The truth is great, right? I mean, it's the truth. Why would I hate the truth?" But most people are afraid of what the truth might reveal. They're comfortable with certain aspects of the truth as they've known it, and they're comfortable with certain inquiries or lines of inquiry that they have been familiar with. But the problem with a prophet is that a prophet comes in and talks about all the things you don't want to talk about, because that's kind of a prophet's job. So you can understand how a lot of people might feel like, I don't want to hear this, and you're rude, and you're full of yourself, and you think you know me, but you really don't, and all these other kinds of things. And it's very uncomfortable because the prophet has two choices: either to remain silent if he even can, and try to awkwardly fit in when he has no purpose other than what he's currently not doing, or he can do what he's supposed to do, and people can be upset with him a lot. So that's kind of a hard life. I have had a pretty difficult time of it at various different portions of my life and with different people. I've had to process through a lot of that, though, and I think that what I would say for most prophets is, if God calls you to minister in a church, then you should tell the truth there. And even Jesus because the apostles sort of functioned in that same way. They were emissaries for Jesus, telling the truth, presenting the truth, and they had a prophetic ministry in a sense. And he told them, if you go to a town and you're preaching the truth to them, preaching the gospel to them, and they don't want to hear it, leave. Shake the dust off of your shoes and leave. And I think it's important for prophets, because part of the thing is that, like, if you do have that stranger trauma, you really do want to be accepted, and you want to find a place where you are accepted. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to leave places that don't accept you. Because if you really desperately want to be accepted, sometimes it's kind of like a scab or something else. Like the people, it's the people that have rejected you that you really focus on. Like, how am I going to figure this out? How am I going to like get them on my side? How am I going to get them to agree with me? And so you almost get like stuck in those places sometimes, um, trying to convince people that where you're not welcome, that you really do care about them and want to do good for them, and and what Jesus says is don't do that. Like, present the truth, tell the truth. If they are not having any of it and won't welcome you, then leave. And I think that's one of the things I'll definitely say to any person who's operating in sort of that prophetic um, capacity is, do your job. Like if God calls you to tell the truth to a certain group of people, wherever you are, wherever you're at, or wherever He sends you, do that. But if they reject it, unless He makes it really clear, no, I want you to keep pushing. I want you to keep pushing. They're not going to listen to you. I mean, that was Isaiah's ministry, right? That he was called directly and commissioned to go to a people that it says explicitly would not listen to him. I mean, that's what it says. It says that you are going so that their hearts will be hard and so that they will be culpable because they've heard the truth, but they haven't really heard it. They've seen, but they haven't really seen. And they're not, and they have hard hearts and the dull of heart and fat of heart and all this other kind of stuff. So, like, that would have been a pretty miserable commission, right, to get from God, for Him to come to you and be like, here's the thing I want you to do. You're going to completely fail at it, but I'm going to send you off to this thing to say these things to these people. They're going to reject you. They're not going to listen to a thing. But Isaiah did it, and I'm thankful he did, because Isaiah is a beautiful book too, and I'm thankful for his ministry now. And also, the generations oftentimes that came after were thankful for his ministry. And that's the other thing about a prophet, is you may not be honored in your home country. You may not have honor in your own time, but that doesn't mean that your work is going to be ultimately or completely useless in the world either. Because a lot of the people who I would consider to be prophets of their times, even if you're just talking about prophets of science or prophets of literature or prophets of art or prophets of industry, very often they have to push through massive amounts of resistance because people have comfortable ways of doing things, and they've got their structures and their habits. And when you come in and say, hey, I've got a totally different way, it'll revolutionize everything, it's hard for them to believe you. A lot of people, most people, will just say, well, what we're doing kind of works, and we don't really need to turn over the entire system we've got going just so that we can get a few, modular increases in efficiency or in productivity or whatever. I mean, we're not getting much. We're not, and not only that, we don't even know that you're right. You could be wrong, and we could do all this work and try and make it happen. And then at the end of all of that, just be like, oops, sorry, made things worse. So it's typical that, a prophet in any area is kind of rejected in his time and by his own people. And, but eventually, usually, if you give it some time, if it actually is valid, true work, it does usually last, and it does usually end up being honored. I mean, even Jesus said to the Pharisees, "You honor prophets, you build memorials to prophets your fathers murdered." So the idea being like, even even with the Pharisees and the people who persecuted and killed prophets, they only killed their own prophets. They honored all the ones that came before. And I feel that's a kind of similar situation too. I mean, I don't want to get too spicy, but I do feel like if John Calvin or Martin Luther or Zwingli or any of the reformers were to show up at most Protestant churches today, they wouldn't be well liked. So take that for whatever you want to take that for. But yeah, if God calls you to go someplace, go there. If they reject you, do your job and leave, unless God calls you to stay, and know that the work that you're doing is pleasing to God, and that it is also going to be useful to somebody at some point, and that God will preserve it because it is the truth. and also that you have a special and wonderful opportunity to experience the some of the things that Jesus experienced that a lot of people don't have the opportunity to experience, which is to be a stranger and to be lonely in that way and to be rejected in that way and always feel like you're on the outside. That was something Jesus experienced as well, and you get to share that with him in a way that few people do. So that is a great blessing, actually, to commune with him in that and to have that ability to understand him in those terms. So I would receive that as well. And yeah, that's about all I've got. As I mean, unless you all have follow up questions or anything that you want to ask about the prophet's role in the church, but I mean, I would say you can still be a member of a church and maybe you do your work. I mean, I'm for instance a member at a church and probably will continue to be members or visitors at various different churches, but I don't really feel part of the church system. And I did wonder myself for a really a long time, like, am I more a Jeremiah or am I more a John the Baptist? And that, cool. The cool part about that is that you don't really have to make that choice for yourself, because the people that you are called to or the people that you're attempting to minister to kind of make that choice for you. Um, you can do your best and be respectful and be sincere and love people and be kind. I mean, it is the case that one of the works that a prophet really has to do is to make sure that he is willing to suffer, because if you're not willing to suffer for the sake of another person, then you start to create preemptive mechanisms to try to protect yourself from being rejected and being separated from others. And oftentimes, those very mechanisms are destructive and hurtful and harmful to other people. I've talked about this in my Patreon posts in the past, but it took me a long time. Again, if we're talking about shame and the feelings of inadequacy, being rejected and disconnected from a community can really drive that knife in pretty hard. And for a long time, when I first started working through this, when I was a teenager, when I was a little kid, I was just wounded by people's misunderstandings of me and their rejection of me. And I didn't, and so I was just hurt. And I was like, I don't want to hurt like this anymore. So when I got to a certain age, I just started hating people. My thought was, I'm not inadequate. They're inadequate. They're all terrible people. And that's why this is happening. Because they are not getting me because I'm awesome and they're all lame. That was kind of the fix that I had internally so that I could avoid dealing with my feelings of shame and inadequacy. I sort of just, go full on vanity mode and just be like, no, I'm awesome. You guys are terrible. That's why you don't like me, because you're lame. At a certain point, you're like, well, that's not right. I mean, obviously. So maybe they're all right and I am lame and I'm the terrible one. I'm just unlovable and unlikable and defective and broken, and that's why everybody thinks that, is because it's actually true. I'm the bad one and they're okay. That's obviously not the case either. But and you'd think that it would be one or the other, either I'm right and you're wrong, or you're right and I'm wrong. I don't think it's actually either of those, though, because we're just different. I'm just a different person. And that doesn't mean that they're bad or wrong for viewing the world differently than I do or having different priorities than I do. They just do have different priorities than I do. And it turns out that a lot of them have kind of the same priorities. And I'm just like this very odd ball in the middle of it that has vastly different priorities than most people. And learning how to recognize that doesn't make me inadequate, but it also doesn't make them inadequate. And neither of those things need to be allowed to take up root and life in you, or they will create very destructive situations and divisions and ultimately rip people apart. So that is a work that prophets have to do in their own hearts, both to accept that they can be perfect in Christ, and grow from there, and that those other people can be perfect in Christ and grow from their positions, and you don't have to be the same or have the same priorities in order to do that. And so if you're operating in humility and you've operated from a place of sincerity and you are perfect in that way before God, operating from there and growing and owning your mistakes and doing everything you can to live at peace with other people, and they simply won't be at peace with you, and they simply will not believe you, like, you don't have to stay. You don't. You don't have to stay. And maybe they aren't going to make the choice for you to be the John the Baptist. And I've done a lot of the hard work necessary. I mean, I'm 43 now, and I've done a huge amount of work over the years, over the last couple of decades, in dealing with my own roots of bitterness and my resentment and my shame and my feelings of inadequacy and all the other things that I struggled with for a really, really long time, especially as a youth, mostly out of just confusion for why people were operating toward me the way they were. But I feel pretty stable at this point. And yet, even in that case, fully loving people, trying to be sincere, trying to do the best I can to use my gifts for other people's benefit. There are a lot of people who just do not trust me and feel exposed and push me away and treat me very poorly. I don't, I want to be the kind of person that, even though that does hurt me, because it does hurt me because I care about them and I care about our relationship. But I also want to be able to say that, they are really doing the best that they can, and they also need the mercy of God and some breakthroughs in their own ways, and they're probably dealing with their own inadequacies and shames and insecurities and things like that. And so I try to have compassion on those people and not hold them, um, not actually hold them in shame, which would just continue that cycle of judgment, but rather say, you're everything that you're supposed to be at this particular time, and you have everything that you need from God at this particular time to do everything that you need to grow. And, so I can just view them that way and be kind as I can. And, but sometimes, if they ask you to leave, sometimes the nicest thing you can do, the kindest thing you can do is to leave. So, anyway, that's a fairly meandering, long-winded answer to your question, Andre, but I hope that it was of some use, and that all of you can take something from that, even if you're not organized exactly like me. Maybe if you're not organized exactly like me, I recommend doing everything you can to accept the truth and be humble concerning the truth, and recognize that the prophet types in your communities oftentimes do feel very isolated, and maybe you can do something to make them feel a little less isolated by just listening and talking and being vulnerable with them, because that means a whole lot. Um, okay, but I don't need to tell any of you that, because you're all showing up to my live stream and making me feel very heard and considered. So honestly, thank you all for being so kind and considerate to me about that, and wanting to show up and hear me talk. I'm sometimes shocked that that's something anybody wants to do. So thank you. All right. Well, I've got about 20 minutes left, and so if you all have any other questions, you can ask them if you want. But I also, what is the way to apply that approach to people's differences in the world workplace where people may not be whole in God? Is it largely different or the same? Yeah, they may not be whole in God, but the thing is that all they would need to be whole in God is to believe that they were. That's a crazy thing, but it's true. It's true. All they would need to believe that, to be whole in God, is to believe that they were. Um, so in that sense, it's a very different situation when a person is operating in their brokenness and convinced that they cannot do it and they cannot change. As long as you're convinced of that, you can't. You're going to be in bondage to that. So I think that's one of the central differences, is that a person who has rejected their wholeness in God is in bondage to their inadequacies, and therefore in cycles of shame and trying to learn different coping mechanisms in order to overcome that. Um, so the differences that you're talking about are manifold, So if you're talking about people who are believers and who love God and love one another, we are going to have differences that come from our different desires because we're different people. But we're also um, going to have some differences that are created by like the conflicts that James talks about, where we have lusts that war against one another and we're not willing to yield. We're not willing to yield to one another in those things. And those are obviously sinful differences. And so in a workplace or in the world where you're dealing with people who are not operating in the wholeness of God, but rather trying to cope with their own feeling of less thanness, then there's going to be a lot of conflicts and such that are non-resolvable because of that. But I would say that the differences that are created that I would consider holy differences, meaning differences that are not necessarily wicked or sinful differences, not differences of like, from lusts or unyielding or whatever. There are still going to be differences even with totally righteous people because God made each of us an individual. Um, and those differences can be resolved in the ways that I'm talking about. Just to recognize that you're not made the same way that I'm made. I still think that you can do that even with differences with unbelievers, because it's like you don't think what I think, you don't believe what I believe, you don't approach life the way I approach it, um, and so it is still the case that understanding where they're coming from is a really important starting place. I would say everybody pretty much appreciates being heard, understood, seen for what they actually are. And even if you were saying, well, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to convince them that their perspective is wrong, the first thing that you have to do in order to convince them is to understand their perspective. I mean, and actually, like in a way that I could state your perspective in a way that you yourself actually agree with, without prejudgments, without, uh, question begging. And that's pretty challenging for a lot of people to do because they're so convinced already that the things that other people think or believe are wrong that they're not really willing to, just go and understand these people. Just hear them out. And there's nothing to fear from hearing somebody out. So that would be the first thing is if there are differences, the first way to determine where are these differences coming from? Are they differences of personality or are they different? Are they like fundamental differences? Even with some people who claim to be Christians, sometimes you can have fundamental differences because it turns out when the rubber meets the road, they don't have the same priorities that you do, even in terms of like loving God and loving other people. They're just claiming to be Christians, and that can be really difficult. So, but in any way, I would say, in any case, it would be important to hear a person out and listen to them. Like, just like figure out what is going on. Is it a difference of personality? Is it a difference of like, or the differences because that person has a major sin problem or brokenness that you're going to have to cope with or navigate. Even then, understanding them is the place to start. Trying to anyway, trying to be understanding, and so that they can hear her, so that they can feel heard and understood. All right. If I seem tired, it's because I am. I've been waking up really early over the past few days for no reason at all. It is summer break. There is no reason for me to wake up early, but I have been because apparently that's what I'm doing. Anyway, but my body wants to wake up. So one of these days, these past couple of days, I wrote a poem when I woke up super early, and so this is that poem if you want to hear it. I'm going to read it to you anyway. So you can't stop me. Well, some of you probably could, but not if I lock this door, which I could. Anyway. Man, I am having so much trouble today. There you go. Okay. All right, I'm going to try and read this for you all. This is called Lord, When Did We See You? And I'll just give you a couple of notes before I read it. TLDR, if you're not familiar, means too long didn't read, and it is used in the internet world to basically give a summary. So like if you have a really long post and you think people are going to have a hard time reading the entire post, you might put a summary at the top and you do TLDR right next to that summary so that people know, hey, this is the summary of what you could be reading. And then if you want, you can read the full version after. Okay, so that's it. The other thing is AITA is a subreddit. It's Am I the A-hole? And they basically, it's people who come on and they'll ask, Reddit, all the Reddit commenters, Redditors, hey, am I the jerk here, or am I right that this in this situation the other person really is the jerk? And so they're kind of looking for verdicts. The fact that they're writing those and asking that question, as you might imagine, means that most of the time they are the jerk. But anyway, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're like gloriously oblivious. And but here's the poem. It's called Lord, When Did We See You? TLDR, I'm a pretty famous poet as far as poets go. A fan has been sending me a lot of his poems recently, and I'm pretty annoyed about it. I know it sounds bad, but AITA for wishing he'd leave me alone? You all can tell me if I'm missing something here. A few months ago, I met this fan of mine, first name God, pretty randomly at a convention where I was reading some poems. I had just finished reading a few poems from my most recent book and retreated to the green room for a bottle of water and some quiet. And though he wasn't supposed to be there, God found his way to the green room somehow. I saw him in the doorway with this look that I've seen before. He told me he was a big fan and that he liked my first book, especially my poem about how the pileated woodpecker's long tongue twists around its brain. Lots of people like that book, and especially that poem. I had read that poem that night even. It was probably why I was invited, honestly, though I've published 3 books since. But whatever, it's so gratifying to know people like your work, and I didn't want to be rude. But he wouldn't leave. He plopped down on a chair in front of me, and the silence between us, though it maybe wasn't that long, felt heavy. I didn't want to engage. Honestly, I was really tired from the weekend and kind of wanted to have some time by myself to decompress. But he starts up a conversation, and I'm answering his questions and being nice, but I'm yawning because I'm so tired. I feel bad, but I'm really hoping he's reading the room well enough to take a hint. I didn't have the heart to tell him I wanted him to leave. I don't want to be like that, but he's just going on and on. I kind of go quiet, but he's still talking, so excited, just happy to be there. Then he asks if he can share one of his poems with me. I don't really know what to say, so I mumble, sure, and I start to look around for any piece of paper to write the hello@me.com address that I use to subscribe to emails I intend to ignore, because I'm thinking I don't really know this guy, and again, I'm just trying to be polite. But apparently that's not what he had in mind, because he pulls a pretty beat-up moleskin journal from his jacket pocket and starts reading me the poem right then and there. Okay, this is happening, I think, and it's a pretty long poem, too. I zoned out a couple of times, but I tried to seem attentive. He finally spoke the last line and looked up at my face, where maybe he read my polite indifference, so he says, "It's not finished." Yeah, I could tell, but I was trying to be nice, so I told him I thought he really had something there. A few arresting turns of phrase, a good grasp of metaphor and mechanics. He should keep working at it and see where it goes. Who knows? That sort of thing. So he stood up, pleased with himself, and thanked me again, too eagerly, and asked if he could send me some more poems when he got home. I was so relieved he might be leaving soon, and I didn't want to puncture his palpable enthusiasm, so I agreed. But then he takes out his phone and asks for my number to add to his contacts. At this point, I feel like if I try to pivot back to my junk email, I'll hurt his feelings. And I don't want to be like that anyway. You know, yet another poet who lost touch with the fans when he became a celebrity. So I gave him my number. Not even the next day. Dude sends me a text. Hey, this is God. We met tonight. Thanks again for listening. And a bunch of other nice things about me and my poetry, and a link to a PDF, which I did not open. But 3 days later, I wake up in the morning and I'm reminded of him. And again, I feel bad. So I click his link, and it's like, I don't know, 200 poems. I kid you not. At the top of the document, he included a short and unimpressive bio. Most of it is about how he's a bit of a homebody, just happy spending time with his kids, loves nature, enjoys writing poems occasionally, which he says are like his kids too, grown. And then at the end of it, he mentions he has a self-published book. No surprise there. And then he added a note just for me where he says, there's a lot more where these came from, as if that's supposed to make me happy. So I start to read some of his poetry. I'm just curious at this point because this guy is really forward, like he thinks he's someone, but so ordinary, he's almost weird. I get a few poems in, and I gotta be honest with you, I feel bad saying it, but he's just not good. I can't even understand why he thought it was worth it to write most of this stuff, much less send it to me. Pretty poor workmanship. None of his poems feel finished, some are barely started, and the subjects just didn't connect with me. There was one about a bottle cap from a Mexican Coke, quote, glinting and crimson in the sun beside a dumpster in shadow. I still do not know what that means, but that was probably the most engaging of the ones I read. The next poem was a literal conversation about the weather. I'm saying like a really basic automatic script between strangers. Probably rain today. It's what I heard. Hope you brought an umbrella. Yep. Almost aggressively boring. There were at least 5 poems almost exactly like that in the first dozen. I didn't even finish that first batch of poems. How could I? I didn't know what to say about them either, so I didn't reply. A couple days later, he sent me another link to probably hundreds more of his poems. Could be billions. I don't know. I didn't open it. He's been sending me links and well wishes for weeks now, and I still haven't replied. He doesn't even seem upset about it. But I don't know what to tell the poor guy. I don't want to discourage him from writing, and I guess I'm flattered he cares so much about me and my work, but honestly, I'm just irritated. And there's this part of me that just wants to tell him, and I know this is really ugly, and I hope you won't judge me, but I just want to write to tell him to leave me alone, just lose my number. Like I've already given him more of my time than most people like him get. And what does he expect? Like, dude, don't you know who I am? All right. Well, that was it. You can let me know in the chat or not what you think. But yeah, I wrote that one. I woke up in the morning very early with like the germ of it. And you're welcome, Lisa. Thank you. She says, ouch. Yeah, it. I woke up in the morning with the germ of it because I was thinking that a lot of God's poems are like not finished. And a lot of the poems that he writes, either in nature or in the human beings that he creates and the ways that he, organizes all of that stuff together, it feels like not worthy of attention. There's so much in the world, there's so many details in the world that I'm sure God is loving and lovingly caring for that we just find stupid. And so there's part of me that's just like, there's so many people out there and so many things out there that we think we're too important to give our attention to. And there are a lot of people out there who really do need, or at least desperately want attention, and they don't seem worthy of the attention. But I think, when we think about the judgment and that we're going to stand before Jesus and he's going to tell us, what did you do to the least of these? That's what you did to me. And if you knew, it was God that was sending you these hundreds of terrible poems, you probably wouldn't think they were terrible anymore. You'd be like, oh, interesting. I see what you're doing. And even if you did, if like the creator of the universe, which is that's a pretty important person, even if just a more important poet than you was to send you his poems and say, hey, these are not finished, but I was just wondering what you thought, you would be very flattered. You'd read every one. You'd feel like it was a privilege that you had access to these things. And instead, so often I feel like in our various different areas, we cut ourselves off from other people and we act like they're not worth our attention. Even though that is, I mean, that's God extending himself to you. And if you extend yourself toward this person or this, you know, thing in praise, like this ordinary thing, take your attention and put it on something that God has made for a moment and just like spend some time with it and praise God in it, then I think that you will find that because you have attended to it in that way, it is worth it. It becomes worth it. So that was kind of what that was about. And people, I remember I read this to one of my friends who's known me for a really long time, and he's like, I like that you put yourself in the poem as God, which I thought was kind of interesting because he assumes that I'm not a very famous poet, which I find really insulting. No, I'm just joking. Yeah, so, but I did find it interesting because I've actually been both of these people. I've been both the eager person who wants somebody else's attention and they're not giving it to me, but I've also been a person who was, for whatever reason in that context, whether, okay, it could be my kids. My kids, when they were growing up, they thought that I was the most important dude in the house, and they wanted my attention. And there were times when I was like, I don't have time for that, and kind of treated them like I've already given you more than people like you get, you know. Um, so in those terms, I think we all are and can be both the needy person who needs attention and also sometimes the person who doesn't want to give attention because he's too important or she's too important. Anyway, so take that for what it's worth. I hope it's helpful to you. And oh, okay. My mom is asking, what was the reference to people as God's poems you mentioned yesterday? Well, technically, um, it's Ephesians 2, I think, verse 10. It says that we are his workmanship created for good works. The word that's translated workmanship there in that verse is the Greek poema, which it could be translated poem. So, so we are God's poem created for good works. And so that's sort of why I put some of those subtle hints in here when I talked about how God sent the link and the first one was 200 and then he sent more and he said could be billions. I sort of put that in there with the intention of you thinking, oh yeah, because it's God and his people, humans are his poem, so there's billions of them. And also earlier when he said, which he says are like his kids too, which the speaker of the poem groans at. Yeah, so there's various different indications inside the piece that I wrote that that God's poems that He's sending are actually people that, in a sense, and the poems that He sends to you are the people that He puts in your lives as well, and the wonderful things that He makes happen in your life, even the circumstances that you don't like, the ways that He's organizing all those things together. Um, I could read you. I know it's already over 7:30, but I could read you. I wrote another poem recently that I have not read to any of you, I don't think. But it is gotta find it. But yeah, it's one I wrote recently, and it's actually a great example of this because I could have thought this is nothing. I could have ignored this. I could have not even noticed this. But I did notice it, and then when I started to pay attention to it in the writing of it, of this poem, I didn't even realize it was a poem. I was just I had gotten to my car and thinking about what I had just seen, which was just a very common thing in the Costco parking lot. And I started writing about it, just writing down what I had seen, like literally what I had seen. And as I'm doing it, I'm like, oh my goodness, like this, this is very meaningful. Like this is like gripping me. So anyway, I'll read you. This one's called An Epiphany in the Costco Parking Lot. An epiphany in the Costco parking lot. And just so you know, this literally happened. This actually did happen in a Costco parking lot, just in case you're wondering. So this is one of God's poems that he gave me. Once I found the body of Christ at the bottom of a Costco shopping cart. I hadn't noticed him before, but after I had stuffed my trunk till my cart was empty, he then appeared to me from beneath my bargains, a plastic epiphany. He was one of those little compressed wafers, tasteless, still vacuum sealed into the top of a single serving pre-filled fellowship cup. Some blunt force had crushed the container meant to hold the 0.6 ounces he shed for me. So, still film sealed into his tomb, sticky with his own blood, he nestled neatly into one square slot of space made by the metal lattice of the cart, waiting to be found. I slunk across the lot and hurtled my rattling cart to crash inside the corral from a sure distance, turning back to my car smiling as I heard the collisions behind me. I wrote this in my car, idling in the parking lot, and as I wrote, I began to notice him. So I clambered back out and I hurried to find him again, to eat his body, to save him. But someone had by then already retrieved his throne, his chariot, his cross, and returned him back into Costco to find perhaps anyone there miraculously hungry for one serving of anything, even if it is bread from heaven. So that was that one. Anyway, that really happened. I actually did find a single serving communion cup pre-filled in the bottom of a Costco shopping cart in the parking lot. That again, that's just something that I could have overlooked. I could have not noticed, but that was one of God's poems that he was sending me. And I think it's pretty significant. So anyway, that's what we got for today. I hope that you all have a great time tonight. And for the rest of your week, I'll see you in a couple weeks, maybe. But I may have to take a break next month because I will be in, or next time, because I'll be in Nebraska. We're going to go to Nebraska June 24th. We're leaving. So I just have a few more days. Good news, though. I actually finished my, I'm mostly finished. I'm like 90% finished with the script for the next episode of the Nothing Human podcast. So that's good. So all of you that have been waiting with bated breath for the unfolding saga of the Lord's Prayer, you have that to look forward to here, and I'll probably get that done tomorrow, I hope, and be able to post it tomorrow for all of you Nothing Humaners. Like, what's our fan name? I don't want to be like all you Nothing Humans. Anyway, yeah. All right. Well, thank you all, and thank you for coming and engaging. And I hope you have a great night. All right. Thanks. Bye.